The first sound is thunder, except the sky is clear. It's the 4th of July on a wind-salted harbor in Maine, and fireworks crack open like small suns over the water. Red. Gold. Blue. The whole town gasps, children squeal, and somewhere a radio stumbles over "America the Beautiful." On a cedar porch above the docks, two old people squeeze each other's hands and count the seconds between flares as if they're listening for distant avalanches. 10, she whispers. Rest. Then 10 more, he answers, smiling in the glow. They are Eleanor and Daniel Moore, Ellie and Dan, 83 and 85. Their porch light gives them halos. Their laughter is the kind that understands pain and chooses joy anyway. Strangers think they're sweet. Friends know they're fierce. On the coffee table between them sits a dented oxygen canister they no longer need, kept like a family Bible. The paint is scratched. The date is faded. On the metal, by the valve, there is a name done in Sharpie 47 years ago, Eleanor. They met, after all, on the roof of the world, and chose to climb the rest of their lives together. Listen. At 21, Ellie was a nurse's aide from Detroit who took pictures on a borrowed Nikon during night shifts when the emergency room slowed down. She had hands that stopped bleeding and eyes that found the horizon even from a windowless ward. She rationed her pay, sold her car, and told her mother she would fly to Nepal because she wanted to see what thin air does to the truth. At 23, Dan was a steelworker's son from Youngstown who had learned knots before multiplication, the kind of boy who took apart lawn mowers just to see where the spark hid. He had climbed in Colorado on bad boots and borrowed ropes and wrote to a guide he'd never met, saying he'd trade labor for learning. The guide wrote back, "We can always use someone who carries more than he complains." They met at base camp in an April that smelled like yak hair and kerosene and the sour edge of snow. At night the tents hummed like lanterns of breath. Flags chattered prayers into the ice. Guides traded stories, climbers traded bravado, and the mountains said nothing at all. Ellie took blood pressures, taped blisters, and laughed at men who called her kid and tried to carry her pack. Dan hauled loads through the Khumbu icefall with a rope over his shoulder and a song under his breath, moving in the patient rhythm of someone who understood that survival is a tempo, not a burst. "Why are you here?" Ellie asked him, the first time they stepped aside to let a donkey train pass, bells chiming like thin coins. "To find out if the promise I made to myself is true," he said. "What promise?" "That I'm braver than the fear I inherited." She took off her glove and shook his hand. "I'm Ellie." He grinned. Dan. They did not fall in love in the ordinary way. They tied in. The day they climbed through the icefall together, the mountain changed its mind about the weather. A clean sky went mean, the kind of quick, muscular shift that makes even veteran guides swear softly. Wind barreled through the seracs, and somewhere above them the tone of the world rose half a note. A ladder shivered over a crevasse. The rope between them went taut. 10 steps, Dan said, his voice steady. Rest. 10 steps. We choose each one. They chose. They passed into higher camps where soup tasted like metal and laughter sounded like it came from a room you couldn't see. They learned each other's silences. On the Lhotse face, Ellie slipped. In the 2 breaths it took for the planet to rotate and decide whether to keep her, Dan planted his axe and caught her using a wordless, beautiful violence he had never known he possessed. Later, in the pale cave of a tent, he handed her that canister and said, "Take my oxygen." She shook her head. "You first." "I won't if you don't," he said, and she loved him for the quickness of it, for the equality of the bargain. So they shared, passing the mask back and forth like a secret. Breath and then breath again. A vow without a minister. The mountain kept its silence, and their rope made its own ceremony. Summit Day came as a rumor, a lean window in the weather, a hush on the radio, a nod from a man who had seen both sides of death and treated them with the same practical respect. They started in the dark. The stars were a crowded city. At dawn the ridge burned orange, and the world opened like a book to the pages of Tibet and Nepal, and the words on the page were cold and awe and do not linger. They did not reach the top. They turned around 200 meters shy when Ellie's lips went blue-black and Dan said her name the way a person says fire, urgent and grateful all at once. Failure, some called it when they returned. Survival, said others. Love, said the two of them, shrugging into blankets side by side, their fingers tangled beneath the mask between their mouths. A journalist at base camp asked them for a quote. Ellie said, "We found what we came for." Dan said, "We'll carry it down." And they did. Not the mountain summit, but its way: 10 steps, rest, choose, rope, trust, turn back when turning back is the bravest thing, share your air when someone needs it, down through the icefall and across the seas and into the rest of their American life. They tried Boston first, in an apartment above a bakery that started kneading dough at 3 in the morning, the smell of crust and possibility climbing the stairs. Ellie worked nights at Massachusetts General. Dan signed on at a machine shop where the floor was a bright danger of oil and light. On weekends they took trains to New Hampshire, teaching their legs the soft green grammar of the White Mountains. They were poor enough to count coins and rich enough to count windows at sunset. They married under a canopy of maples in a park by the river, promising each other things they had already proven: "I will share my air, I will say your name like fire, I will turn back with you and call it victory." When Boston felt too loud for their quiet, they drove west in a yellow van that coughed like a kindly old dog and stopped where the ground rose into stories again: Boulder, then Leadville, then a small Colorado town whose name tourists forgot but whose trailheads locals could find blindfolded. They opened a tiny shop that sold stove fuel and maps and the kind of boots that last longer than a marriage if you don't treat either correctly. He repaired crampons behind the counter with the gentle hands of a watchmaker. She fit packs to backs like a tailor who could also stop a nosebleed. Young climbers came in on Fridays to brag, and came back on Mondays to buy bandages and listen. Ellie kept a ledger of firsts: first time above tree lean, first avalanche class passed, first hiker who saw lightning and went down instead of up. When a storm took a boy on Long's Peak one September, she wrote his name too, a small grave on paper, and the next weekend her class doubled in size. They wanted children. They tried. They failed. They cried in a bathroom where someone had left a shampoo bottle in the shape of a dolphin, and the joyless silliness of that object made their tears come faster. They went outside and walked until the world made sense again. Passing a playground, they stopped at the fence and watched a boy push a smaller boy on a swing with exaggerated care, and Ellie said, "Maybe our job is to teach the ones who are already here." Dan kissed the top of her head and said, "Then let's be good at it." They were. The shop became a kind of way station: student guides, park rangers, parents who wanted their kids to love something other than a screen. They were the rope team that kept lives from slipping. Then the fire came. It started in October, when the wind got impatient and the grass got ready to burn. A spark leapt a ditch. Houses took flame as if they'd been waiting their whole lives to confess their inner torch. The shop went like paper. Ellie ran in anyway for the first aid kits and a stack of photographs on the wall: kids on summits, a woman with a new knee and a large grin, a man with one hand holding the hand of a child who had two, Ellie and Dan on the Lhotse face, a rope between them, their teeth white against the blue. Smoke took the photos and left the frame. Dan hauled her out and they stood, coughing, watching the inventory of their ministry become heat. Insurance fought them because insurance sometimes fights everybody. Friends cooked them casseroles and sat with them in a rental they didn't know how to love yet. In the mornings, they drove the edges of the burned scar, offering spare boots to people who'd lost their homes, offering, when it was wanted, the simple presence of bodies who knew that everything can look dead for a while and still be alive underneath. When the claim finally came through, they rebuilt smaller and smarter and added a classroom, because survival, like joy, likes to be shared. They aged in increments like all of us do, leaving small coins of youth on every windowsill. Dan's knee became a weather station. Ellie's shoulders remembered every pack she had ever lifted onto someone else. They took to walking at daybreak, when the light was permission and the town woke up like a person, not a machine. They made a list of American summits that were less about altitude than gratitude: Cadillac Mountain, where they held coffee thermoses and watched the first dawn of the new year; Bryce Canyon, where they stared down into cathedral spires of rock and said nothing for an hour; a hill in Kansas with a view so wide it felt like the ocean in reverse. They learned that altitude is a number and awe is a practice. When Dan was 71, his heart shouted at him. It wasn't a heart attack, the doctor said, just a protest, a sign that the factory that had worked without a union for 7 decades wanted better conditions. He went quiet in the exam room, and Ellie took his hand and said, 10 steps. He laughed and said, "Then rest," and the cardiologist, who had not been to the Himalaya but understood metaphors, nodded and wrote down a plan. When Ellie was 73, a shadow slid across an X-ray. The surgeon was kind and the nurse was brisk, and the word was cancer, which is a word like a storm, it doesn't care how you feel about it. They cut the shadow out. They told her to rest. She lay on the couch and made the shape of prayer with her fingers without words and watched birds argue at the feeder. Neighbors brought soup. Dan read aloud from a book about the geology of hope. On the first day she could walk to the corner and back, she cried at the sight of their mailbox, the ridiculous American sturdiness of it, metal flag up for the first time in weeks. "We live here," she said. "We live here," he agreed, and the world nodded and kept spinning. They moved again when the high country asked more of their lungs than they could give. A friend sent a postcard of a lighthouse and wrote, "If you ever want to trade mountains for tides, there's a porch with your names on it." They went to Maine and took the porch and kept their boots. The harbor was a theater of small dramas, boat ropes tossed and caught, gulls with opinions, teenagers practicing flips off the dock and pretending not to notice each other. In the mornings they walked a loop that rose to a lookout where the ocean made and unmade its own arguments. "The mountain comes to us now," Ellie said, and Dan nodded, listening to the beat of his heart, to the hush of her breath, to the long conversation between rock and water. Every year, on the 4th, they climbed the little hill behind their street to watch fireworks. It was their private pilgrimage, their American Himalaya. They started early to beat the crowds and to honor their ritual, 10 steps, rest, then 10 more. Kids passed them running. A dog circled back to check on them, approved of their progress, and returned to his human. On the ridge, families spread blankets, someone tuned a guitar, and a woman used a lighter to coax a candle into being against the wind. Ellie and Dan sat, as always, a little apart, in the seam between the show and the quiet. One year, the year the story opens, the air felt not just festive but charged. As the first rocket sewed a bright stitch into the sky, a young man stumbled near the tree line and dropped to one knee, then both. His face was gray and the fireworks red. A child started to cry. The crowd rippled the way a flock does when a hawk's shadow crosses it. Ellie was on her feet before the second volley. Old habit. Old oath. "Stay with me," she told the boy, kneeling, voice firm and kind. "What's your name?" "Leo," he said, which came out like a question. "Leo, I'm Ellie. This is Dan. We're going to breathe together." She felt his pulse, the frightened rabbit of it. Heat. Dehydration. Panic dressing itself up as catastrophe. She handed Dan her water bottle and he opened it like a magician, calm, and poured some on a bandana while she talked Leo back into his body. 10 breaths. Rest. 10 breaths. His eyes focused. The crowd loosened around them. Someone brought Gatorade. Someone else offered the kid a Pop-Tart with the solemn generosity of the very young. By the finale, Leo could sit up. "I'm okay," he said, embarrassed. "I thought. Bodies think lots of things they don't have to keep thinking," Ellie said. "You're okay. You scared yourself and now you know something." "What?" Leo asked, almost smiling. "That you can come back," Dan said. The last rocket burst into chrysanthemum light. People clapped at the sky. Ellie and Dan clapped for the boy. When the darkness settled back over the harbor and the embers drifted toward the sea, the two old climbers walked home. Leo's mother hugged them at the foot of the hill and cried in that grateful, private way strangers cry in public when the world doesn't break after all. Ellie said, "Get him salt tomorrow." Dan advised, "Let him be brave in small ways." They went on, the two of them, hands folded together like a map that has already learned where it's going. Back on their porch, they sat in the after quiet. The town exhaled. Somewhere a dog barked at the sudden dark and then forgave it. Dan reached for the oxygen canister, set it between them, and touched the inked name that was his favorite word. "Remember the reporter?" he asked. "At base camp?" "I remember his pen leaking," Ellie said, smiling. "I remember he asked you if you were disappointed." "I told him the truth," Dan said. "We found what we came for." He looked at her. We keep finding it. They tell this story on mornings when fog makes the harbor into a different country. They tell it when kids from the high school knock on their door to borrow maps for a geography project and end up staying for tea and hearing, with the reverence of the young, about a mountain that is both myth and address. They tell it, sometimes, to each other when the waiting room is cold and the nurse calls someone else first and the coffee machine is out of cups. 10 steps, Ellie says, and Dan says, rest, and they smile like conspirators who stole a jewel and got away with it. They write letters now, on paper, with ink that behaves itself, to nieces and nephews and godchildren and the son of a friend who went into the Coast Guard, to a woman who once hiked in their class and later became a ranger and now writes back from a fire tower in Montana about the language of smoke. They write to Leo, who sends selfies from trailheads and tells them which snacks are most appropriately heroic. They sign the letters the same way every time, because tone is a rope too. Keep going. Share your air. Turn back when you must and call that a summit. Love, E and D. Sometimes, when the wind is right, the lighthouse sends its sound into their yard like a low question. Sometimes, when the night is still, Ellie hears Dan's breath slow and thinks of the tent and the mask and the bargain. If she's merely drowsy, she tells him a joke. If she's awake in the rectangle of dawn, she talks to the photographs on the mantel, or a younger Ellie is taped to a younger Dan by a length of red rope, or a newer Ellie leans on a newer cane beside a salt-silvered Dan and both are laughing. We made it, she says quietly to both of them, the old and the young and the in-between. We keep making it. What is happy ever after, really? It is not a castle or a fade-out. It's coffee that tastes like memory. It's a van that should have died in Utah but didn't. It's a boot repaired a 5th time because the leather remembers your foot. It's arguments about the best way to fold a map. It's an apology before sleep and a hand held out in the ripe blue of morning. It's a classroom over a deer shop. It's kids who learn lightning is not for heroes. It's a mailbox at the corner and the blessing of having to walk to it. It's the kind of health you earn by listening. It's weddings attended, funerals stood through, casseroles baked in borrowed kitchens. It's failing to summit and calling it triumph. It's the thing you do after the worst thing, and the 10 steps after that. If you ask them for advice, if you knock with a microphone and a smile and say it's for a show, for the internet, for posterity, they will give you a list they've been refining without writing down. Carry water. Carry less anger. Carry a joke. Know your weather. If you can't, know your rope team. Turn back earlier than your pride wants and later than your fear suggests. Tell the truth quicker. Accept help quicker. Offer it first. Never be ashamed to rest. Sing, even badly. Take pictures of your old people while they are still doing the thing they love, and then show them the pictures right away. If you get scared, breathe. If that doesn't work, breathe with someone else. Leave the places you love better than you found them, including your own heart. They don't add fall in love on Everest, because that part was luck. But they will tell you the secret they learned at 26,000 feet and have practiced on sidewalks and hospital floors and grocery store aisles ever since. Sharing your air is not just about oxygen. It's about time, attention, and the courage to put your breath where someone else's fear is. On the morning after the fireworks, the harbor is busy with the gentle work of returning to normal. The trash cans at the park are full of paper stars. The gulls have opinions about everything. Ellie laces her shoes in slow loops. Dan tests his knee like you test a bridge you built yourself, with trust and a little awe. Where to today, he asks. Up to the lookout, she says. Or as far as we feel like. We can turn back and still call it a summit. He laughs. We'll scandalize the purists. We always have, she says. They step into the day. 10 paces. Rest. A neighbor waves from a porch. A kid pedals past on a bike, one hand in the air as if proving something to the wind. The lighthouse blinks, patient as an old teacher. The trail climbs and then softens, and so do they. At the halfway rock, they stop and drink water and watch the tide sketch its long letter to the shore. If you could see them from a distance, you would say they are small, 2 dots moving against a big blue sentence. If you stand near them, you would feel it, the heat of their shared weather, the quiet fire that began a lifetime ago, an air too thin for lies. Once, in a different era, they turned back for a love that could live. Now, in this era, they keep going for the same reason. They live in America, a nation of porches and protests and power outages and parades, of forests that burn and grow back, of mountains that are older than apology and newer than hope every time the sun hits them. They are citizens of that weather and of each other. At the lookout, they sit, not because they must but because they like the view better this way. The ocean wakes up further. A boat leaves a white sentence on the water that ends in an ellipsis. Dan takes Ellie's hand, and she takes the moment and holds it lightly, so it won't bruise. 10 more, he asks. She smiles. Always. They stand. They walk. They go down together, taking care with the stones, talking about breakfast, about a letter they want to write to Leo, about a new kid who needs boots, about the best route to the farmer's market before the corn is gone. The day opens, ordinary and holy. And if you listen closely, you can hear it, that thin, fierce music that once threaded between ice towers and now threads between gulls and porch railings, the sound of two people still sharing their air. That's the story. Not because it's over, but because it keeps beginning.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We've got plenty more stories coming your way.